Hey, good morning. How are you going with John's Gospel? I'm loving getting into John's Gospel this year. And actually, I love some of it, actually. I really love getting into the ideas and the passage, and I love actually the chance to do this, to actually kind of explain and open up the Bible with. But in terms of preparing sermons, I really hate the middle part. Like, it really stresses me out. I'm not sure if I can really communicate. I have to talk to Suze a bit about this, because I pass it on to her a little bit, which is not fair, really. But yeah, I get really stressed out, worried, anxious, and been chatting to Suze a bit about why. Why am I so anxious in that space? And there's probably a whole bunch of reasons, but probably one of the key ones is I really like people to like me, to please people. And the idea of talking about difficult things or hard things, I'm not that keen on doing that. And we could kind of sit here and I could try to share with you all the amazing things that I found in this passage, but that's really not what this is about. As we come to open the scriptures and to hear them preached, what we're doing is we're wanting to actually meet and hear what God wants to say to us. And so it's not okay for me just to kind of plaster over the bits that I don't want to say. I need to say everything. And I need to say particularly what God wants to say to us. What is it that God wishes to say to us today from John chapter 5? And to try to unpack that, there's a couple of things. I think what we do is we pray. I pray and you pray, and we read the scriptures. So I've been reading the scriptures over the last few weeks, and you do too, reading through John's Gospel, seeking to understand who God is, what He's like. And then as we look at what it's saying, we also pay attention to how John is communicating this story of Jesus to us, because it's in this story of Jesus that we will hear actually God speaking. We'll come to know what His voice wants to say to us today. And there are some things actually that are really helpful in terms of that structure that might help us as we dig into the passage to understand what it's about. So the first is one that Brad actually shared with us right at the beginning. He shared with us that at the end of John's Gospel, in John chapter 20, John shared with us the purpose for which he wrote the book. He said, Jesus has done many other signs, but these signs are written, in chapter 20, verse 31, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in His name. And so as we look into this individual story in John's Gospel, we realise that, so God might be unpacking what He means by that. What does it mean to believe that Jesus is the Son of God? And what does He mean when He says that we may have life in His name? And some of those things are going to come out in our passage. Other things that are really helpful is to understand kind of the patterns that John has actually written into his Gospel to communicate to us. I'd recommend to you the Bible Project. So they started out doing things like this, like structures of the biblical books and how the message of that book can be portrayed even in pictures, which is really cool. Like Suze is very much a visual learner. She loves it, and I do too. And they one of the things that they do is they kind of zoom in, and you can kind of see where your passage fits in the big picture of the whole book. So we're actually in a section where John's going to talk about 4 different Jewish festivals and how Jesus fulfills those festivals. And we're at the first one, the Sabbath, today. And so that's given us another clue about what God's message to us might be. That there's something about Sabbath and rest that's going to come through to us. But one of the things as well that I've discovered as I've been reading is that John has also put in this structure of signs throughout the first half of the book of John. And you come across them. The first one was the wedding at Cana, Galilee, turning the water into wine. And this is another one of Jesus' signs. But often what happens is Jesus does this sign and then people respond to the sign. And often there's opposition or belief, or you have to try to figure out who Jesus is. And in trying to figure that out, Jesus often does a speech to explain the sign. It's like this sign that Susie and I found when we were hiking recently. So it's the sign to the Stinson wreck. You can see the little sign at the top. And it's clearly pointing you the direction and telling you that's the way to go. But the people who've been there before realise that sign's not enough. If you were to stand there and have a look at that, you see the steepness of that? That's basically how steep that track is. Like, it is crazy steep. We didn't do it because we were warned against it. But these people have written another sign, like another description, so that you could interpret this sign. So you could understand what it actually means. So they're saying, well, it's really hard. And it's make sure you bring water, and it's 600 metres elevation up from here. So, basically they're saying, if you're not prepared, don't take this path. Okay? Which is really helpful when you get to that point. Because you've got to think, oh, Stinson wreck, I absolutely want to go there. That sounds amazing. And that's kind of how these signs are happening and are working in John's Gospel. You get these signs, and sometimes you scratch your head going, what do they mean? But then you have Jesus explaining the sign in a speech or a story. And those speeches actually help to interpret the sign. So that's actually what we're going to use as a structure for the sermon today. What we're going to do is we're going to look at, firstly, the sign. There's the story of Jesus healing a man. And then we're going to look at his speech, Jesus' speech, explaining what that sign means. And then we're going to finish up kind of going back to the sign and some of the questions that we had and seeing if we can answer those and how that might speak to us today. So that's a lot to say as an introduction, but let me pray that God would use this time, that he might speak. Let me pray. Now, Father, we thank you for the chance to open your word, and we thank you that you want to speak to us. We thank you particularly for speaking to us in your Son. And we've gathered together to open your word and to hear it preached, that you might speak. And we pray that you do that now. That you would speak your words of life into our lives, and you would bring times of rest and refreshment and real healing to us as we hear and believe this good news. Amen. So let's get into the story. So the first part of this passage is the sign of when Jesus rocks into Jerusalem. And we're introduced in this story to a grumpy disabled man. Now, I'm not quite sure if I'm allowed to say that. But a grumpy he's really grumpy, don't you think? I'm not quite sure how to take this man at some aspects, but he's definitely not a man that I warm to. This guy has been unable to walk for 38 years. Just imagine that, being in that situation. And every day he gets himself down to this pool. It's a pool called Bethesda. And you can actually go there now in Jerusalem. They dug it up a few years ago. And at the time of Jesus, there was water in this pool, and there was a superstition that when the water was stirred up, the first one who could get in the water, they'd be healed. All right. And this guy was there every day. He was trying to get in, but he just couldn't get in to the water. A couple of weeks ago in our Bible study, we were looking at another man who couldn't walk. And he was surrounded by friends who just picked up his mat that he was lying on, and they dug a hole and they lowered him through the roof right in front of Jesus. But this guy doesn't have anybody in his life. There's no people in his life around him to help him. And there's something going on there. Like, even disabled people have friends. Like, this man does not have any friends. No one around him. For 38 years, he was like this. But one day, Jesus comes into Jerusalem on one of the Jewish festivals. It's one of the times, all the times that Jews and others would go up to Jerusalem for these festivals. And Jesus rocks up to this festival, and he comes across all these hundreds of people kind of around this pool. And out of those hundreds of people, he singles out this guy. And he goes up to him and he says, "Do you want to get well?" I wonder why. Like, why does Jesus signal out this guy? Do you have any ideas, any thoughts about that? Well, yeah, maybe we can, as we unpack the passage, maybe we can come back to that question. But as the guy responds to Jesus, do you hear the grumpiness in his voice as he responds? He says, he doesn't kind of say, "Oh yeah, Jesus, that sounds great, yes please." He just kind of makes excuses. He says, "Well, there's no one here to help me. And someone else beats me down to the water every time." It's basically saying, it's not my fault, hey, come on, leave me alone. Like, what a stupid question. Of course, yeah. But in the midst of all that gruffness and grumpiness, Jesus still pursues him. And he says to this man, "Hey, get up, raise up on your feet. Get up, take up your mat and walk." And miraculously, life and wholeness comes into his body, and he's able to stand after 38 years of not being able to walk. He's able to get up on his feet, and he's able to walk. It bamboozles me that he doesn't ask Jesus his name at this point. Jesus is able to get away without this guy. It just makes me wonder how much he's all tied up in himself. He's totally not really thinking about who has done this for him. He's just looking at himself going, "Wow, this is amazing." And he picks up his mat and he starts to walk. And that's when the problem starts to happen. See, the day that Jesus did this to this man, heals him, was a Sabbath. And the Jewish leaders say to this man, "Hey, you can't carry your mat on the Sabbath. That's working." Now, maybe this takes a little bit of explanation, because God actually, in the Old Testament, had set up this pattern of 6 days of working and then 1 day of rest from your work. And it was called the Sabbath. And the idea was that you would rest from your everyday work. So I'm a physio, so 1 day out of 7 I would not do physio work. And it was a real refreshment and time of rest for God's people. But the Jewish leaders at the time were concerned that actually maybe people would still work, and so they started to put rules around the rules. Like, they said, well, what is work? Maybe you can pick things up, but if you put them on your shoulder, that's work. Okay, you can't do that on the Sabbath. And you can't move something from one house to another house, but you can move something within your own house. That's not really work. And so they're a bit of a stickler for the rules, these guys. And as they see this man walking, I can just picture him, mat rolled up, on his shoulders, bounding through the city. And they go, "Hey, what are you doing? You're breaking the rules here. You can't do that." And at this point, he dobs Jesus in. He doesn't even know his name, but he dobs Jesus in. He says, "Hey, it's not my fault. The man who made me well, he's the guy you should take this up with." And later on, he's at the temple, and Jesus finds him. He seems to be seeking his man out. And he says to him some words which are really quite startling. He says to him in verse 14, he says, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." Now, at this point, I think we're going to have to stop and pause. Do you see the implications of what Jesus says here? This man's suffering of 38 years was somehow related to his sin. What, really? Now, just a quick note. Jesus isn't saying that if someone is suffering, that's because of their sin. No. Like, just a few chapters later, in John chapter 9, he's going to come across a man who was born blind, and his disciples are going to say, hey, who sinned, this guy or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus says, no, neither of them sinned. This man's suffering was not caused by his sin. So we can't do that. We can't look at someone's suffering and say, oh, that guy, he deserves it, absolutely deserves it because of his sin. We don't have the vision to be able to look into people's lives and know if it was something that they caused or something that someone else caused or just some randomness in their life caused the suffering coming in their life. But for somehow, Jesus knows this man and he knows his story and what happened for him. He gets a sense that somehow this man's sin was the cause of his suffering. Now, again, what is sin? If I'm going to try to explain to you what sin is, like, how do I explain it to myself even? Because it's a kind of a religious word that we use often, and we don't really explain it. It's really a kind of a picture of saying to God, hey, I know you made the world and you care for me, but I'm deciding not to go your way. I'm going to kind of make my own choices about what's good and evil and not really pay attention to your choices about what's good and evil. And I'm going to make it up for myself. That's actually what the Bible describes as sin. And behaviour that comes out of that is described as sinful behaviour, that we are acting in ways that God has said is not good, but we think that they're good, maybe for us or for what we want. And for this man, God only knows what sort of things he was doing when he was a younger man to cause his suffering, but I think we could imagine many different scenarios where the pride of a young man thinking that he knew better than God's way ended in his own undoing. Like, that doesn't seem unreasonable, that this man's rebellion against God led to not just other people suffering, but his own suffering in some way. Well, we don't know his story, but Jesus seems to know his story, and he speaks into this man's life. Isn't it interesting that Jesus picks this guy out from all of the crowd? I wonder why this guy. But in the midst of all of that, Jesus he's really concerned to pointing him to something new, not just his past, but he's using his past to actually give him a warning, a mercy, a warning for something in the future. Something that is even more serious than his 38 years of illness. He says, stop sinning or something worse may happen to you. What could be worse and more serious than 38 years of illness? Like, wow. And Jesus doesn't really explain that here, but maybe that's where the story that's unfolding and Jesus' message later on, that might help us as we come back to that. So what happens next is this grumpy old man, he goes off and he dobs Jesus into the Jewish leaders. I just can't believe this guy. He tells them that it was Jesus who had made him well. And whatever his reason, the authorities now know who's been telling people to carry their mats on the Sabbath. Jesus. And they go after him. And so as they go after him, Jesus defends himself. But he does it in a way that actually gets him into more trouble. He says, in verse 17, he says, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working." Wow, if the Sabbath thing had kind of stirred them up a bit, now they want to kill him because he's claiming to be equal with God, even calling God his own Father. So all of that we've been talking about is actually the sign that Jesus performed in Jerusalem with this man. And now we come across the speech that helps us to understand what it means. It's actually from verse 19 to 47, and Jesus kind of unpacks what he's been doing all along. Now today we're going to focus on verses 19 to 30 and this grumpy guy, and next week Brad is going to focus on 31 to 45 and the Jewish leaders. So let's unpack what Jesus says in his speech to the Jewish leaders. It's actually, it turns out, it's all about work. Because that's how Jesus defends himself about breaking the Sabbath, the day of rest. You see, Jesus claims that he is working on the Sabbath just like God, his Father. It's a pretty bold claim to make as a human, that you have the authority to do what God does. And the Jewish leaders get really worried that Jesus is actually vying for God's place here, claiming the place that only God should have in our hearts. So Jesus explains this relationship that he has with his Father, that it's not one of competition. He's not vying for God's place. But this relationship that he has with his Father is one of love. The love between a father and a son. Have a look with me through this from 19 through to verse 29. You get this picture of the Father giving everything over to the Son. He shows him everything that he has. He shows him everything that he's doing because he loves him. He entrusts, life and judgment, the raising of the dead, all authority. He trusts all of that into his Son's hands because he loves him. And the Son, he wants to please his Father. And so, out of love, he delights to do just what the Father shows him, and nothing more. And in so doing, he reveals to us the works of the Father. Did you catch that? At the heart of this relationship is love. It makes me think of how little kids look up to their parents and copy them. So you might try to tell your child something to do, and they might not listen to you, but they will copy you. Sometimes we don't want them to copy us, and sometimes it's just delightful that they do. I found this picture on the internet of a mum who's working hard at a computer, maybe in lockdown or whatever, and look at what the daughter's done. She's copied every single little mannerism of the mum. Have you seen that before with kids and how they look up to their parents and kind of copy them? Kids are like that. They look up and they see what is happening and they go, oh, that's how you do it. Okay, I'll do it that way too. Cool. And it reminds me actually of Susie and her mum. So a while back she was trying to learn how to cook pastry, and she called up her mum's recipes of how to do it, and she tried to follow the recipes, but it always turned out terrible. Like it just was not right, because she knew what was right. She'd tasted her mum's pastry before, and so she just threw up her hands one day and called her mum and said, okay, I'm coming over. And she took all of the pastry stuff, set it up in her mum's place, and as she was cooking, her mum would come past and feel the dough, and she'd say, oh, a bit more flour. And so Suze would feel that and go, okay. Oh, okay. So then she put a bit more in and she'd come back, oh, no, a bit more water. Okay. I don't know about these things, but they do. So Susie is looking up to her mum and copying her. And now Susie's pastry is just like her mum's. It is beautiful. It's actually it's the way that trades were passed down in the ancient days, like even Joseph and Jesus. So Jesus' dad, earthly dad,
was a carpenter. And Jesus would have been in the carpentry shop and would have picked up a tool that he saw his father working and realised, okay, that's how you hold it and that's how you... And he is looking up to his father and copying him. And just doing what he could see his father doing. And it turns out that at the heart of the universe, at the heart of this God that we are coming to know in Jesus, is a relationship of love between a father and a son, where a father delights to give everything over to the son, and where the father, it just fills his heart to please his father. That's what the son's heart is. Why does that make a difference? Well, to me that makes my heart sing. That this is the God who is inviting us into his own life, into his own relationship. That he wants us to partake of something of what this love is like between him, the Father, and the Son. And I'm drawn to that. Aren't you? Sorry, I got a bit carried away there. So in the story, we have this picture of Jesus just explaining about the work that both his Father and he himself are carrying out. So what is that work? What is the work that they are carrying out in this world? Well, there might be a couple of different ways of explaining that. So one of them is to say that they are raising the dead and giving them life. Well, okay, so that's a pretty big thing to say. The work of God in the world is raising the dead and giving them life. Let me try to show you in the passage. So please open your Bibles. John chapter 5 in verse 21. He says, "For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it." And then jump with me down to verse 25. He says, "Very truly I tell you, a time is coming, and has now come, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself." And then lastly, in verse 28, he says, "Do not be amazed at this, for a time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done what is good will rise to live, and those who have done what is evil will rise to be condemned." Wow, that is the work of God, to raise the dead. As you read through the Old Testament, you get a picture of how God is working tirelessly to undo the effects of our sin, our rebellion, and turning away from him. And God has been working to swap that around, to change all of that, and to undo all of that and the effects upon our world. And as you read through the Old Testament, you get this expectation that comes up again and again that God's going to come and return to his people. And on the last day, he's going to make all things right. And to do that, he's going to judge sin and restore life to the world that he's made. And on that last day would come not just a resurrection, but a bodily resurrection of the dead, when people would be judged. Jesus is speaking about that day as it's still to come. If you look in verse 28, he says that for a time is coming when this is going to happen. So that's Jesus saying that's still off into the future, but he's also saying that his coming into this world, in his coming into this world, that day has started already. Have a look at him in verse 25. He says, "A time is coming and has now come." And as people hear Jesus' voice and believe him, they, in a sense, they have already passed from death over to life. It's as if that judgment on the last day has already been declared on those who hear Jesus' words and believe him today. He sums it up in verse 24 really succinctly. He says, "Truly I tell you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life and will not be judged, but has crossed over from death to life." Now, another way of putting that, this work that the Father and the Son are united in doing, is that they're actually bringing the real Sabbath rest that the world has been yearning for since our fall into sin, our rebelling against God, right back at the beginning of the story of the Bible. That's why this whole thing comes about on the Sabbath. It's really about a rest, really, finally from our sin and our suffering. A rest that is beautiful and bodily and tangible. See, the Christian hope of the life to come beyond death is a bodily one. We believe in the resurrection of the body because of passages like this one. We don't believe that you just kind of, when you die, you don't float up into the sky as some spirit. Like, that's not the Christian hope. We believe actually that Jesus in some day in the future will speak again and will raise us bodily to life. Now, to tell you the truth, I find this hard to believe. That we are going to be raised bodily. It doesn't, well, in one sense it doesn't make sense to me. Like, I look around at the world and me and I think, how is God going to do this? Like, how is he going to raise people bodily from the dead to live with him? The only reason why I believe it is passages like this that say, and so I go, okay, well, you're saying it like this, but particularly because Jesus was raised bodily from the dead. In one sense, that's the only reason why I believe this is true. Like, it's already happened in Jesus. We've seen it, and his disciples saw him raised bodily from the dead. And although, you know, there's definitely, if I was speaking to you truly, like I'm trying to, I would go, oh, I really find it hard to understand how that's going to happen. I believe it's really true. That on the last day that God will raise people from death to life in real bodies. That this isn't just some pie in the sky hope, but it's physical and tangible and beautiful. But how is it that Jesus can offer us this life when we are in this world of sin and suffering? And, well, it's because Jesus somehow, in having life in himself, in the biggest story of John's Gospel, you realise that he offers up his very life for the sins of the world. He takes the condemnation that we deserve so that we might have his life. He takes up the authority to judge because he's the Son of Man, one of us, with all the authority of God as well. But then, he then lets that judgment fall on him in our place. And he speaks a word of life now so that people can escape that final day of judgment that is still to come. This is mercy indeed. The other side. This is the other side of verse 24, though. Verse 24. The other side of this resurrection to life was a resurrection to condemnation, and you actually see it. We've seen it back in chapter 3, verse 18. John said that whoever believes in Jesus is not condemned, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already, because they haven't believed in the name of God's one and only Son. Now, this is stuff I don't really like to talk about. Sadly, John's Gospel tells us that there are some who see Jesus as light and prefer the darkness. And so they don't come to him for life. And on the last day, John says that they will be raised and they will bear their own condemnation. But it's clearly what God is saying here. You can't really get beyond it. But the good news is that Jesus has come before that great and terrible day. That people would receive life and not judgment. That all who honour Jesus, all who hear his voice and believe him, will have resurrected life even now. Wow. So this is a pretty amazing speech that Jesus gives. And with all of these amazing ideas and thoughts flowing we've been hearing from Jesus, let's go back to that grumpy man and the questions that we had about him and see if we can make sense of the sign that Jesus was giving to this man. Now, if I remember rightly, our first question was, why this guy? Why does Jesus single out this fella? Well, let's be clear. It's not because of his sterling character. This man doesn't deserve it, does he? It turns out it's because of his own sin that he's in this mess. And maybe that's why Jesus singles him out. Jesus gives him life purely on the basis of God's mercy and grace. And this is such good news for us, for you and for me, that Jesus would take an interest even in us, in the place that we've ended up and the mess that we've got ourselves into. He's not put off by our past or the faults in our character. He's interested even in grumpy ones like us. He just sees our need for life and he offers it up to us freely. Maybe this is for you. The second question was, well, what could be worse than 38 years of illness that could come upon this guy if he didn't turn from sinning back to God? Well, it seems clear now that Jesus was speaking of the judgment in the future, when those who have done evil will rise and be condemned, will experience their own condemnation. It's clearly worse than even 38 years of illness. But the reason Jesus has come, and the reason why he actually approaches this man for the second time, is he wants him to escape it. He wants us to escape this judgment. Yeah. So Jesus' act of healing this man, it turns out, was an act of mercy twice over. Firstly, he received his life back again. With legs under him, he could be part of all of the wonderful things that God has stitched into our world. But secondly, Jesus didn't want him to just continue his life of rebellion and rejection of God and suffer the consequences of missing the life to come. He's given him a foretaste, a picture of life from the dead, so that he wouldn't miss the life that Jesus offered on the other side of the resurrection of the last day. And so this passage also speaks a message of warning and mercy to us, to me and to you. God has touched each of us with a miracle of life. Wow. How good is that? How good is the life that God has given us? But you, like me, know that we have time and time again, we've stuffed up. We've turned away from God's ways and we've just decided, no, I want to do this my way. And we have made a mess of our lives. We've taken up this life as if it's all about us. And so Jesus' powerful voice, he speaks to us. And he says, rise up, believe in me, and have life from the dead. In the end, I think this passage has a wonderful message that Jesus goes up after even grumpy people like us. Maybe there's hope for us after all. See you guys.